Hello, everyone, and thanks, Haley, and thank you for joining us today. It's my pleasure to be kicking off this seminar with the first presentation. I'd just like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land from which I'm signing in today, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. So I'm Chris Dowling, as Haley said. I'm a research manager with the AIC, and I want to start the seminar today by canvassing a series of studies that I've led recently for the AIC, examining a police risk assessment tool for domestic violence that's used here in the ACT. Now, these studies focus specifically on examining and improving how accurately the tool predicts further violence. So I'll walk you through what we did and what we found as part of that research. And in the process, I hope to impress on everyone the importance of taking steps to empirically verify risk assessment tools to ensure that they can be used to effectively channel resources to cases where they are most needed and ultimately benefit victims. So as I'm sure you're all aware, family and domestic violence occupies a significant portion of the time and resources of police and many other frontline workers. And while much of this violence continues to be unreported, increasing chunks of it are coming to the attention of police and others. Now, while this is obviously a good thing for many reasons, it does create further pressure for these resource-strapped agencies and services who are charged with responding to this violence. Now, in deciding how to channel their often limited resources, these agencies and services obviously need to prioritise certain cases. And the risk of further violence greatly influences how they go about undertaking this prioritisation. Now, risk assessment tools have proliferated to standardise, document and improve estimations of risk to ensure that more serious cases where there is a higher likelihood of further violence get the attention they require by these services and agencies. In terms of what these risk assessment tools look like, they typically consist of both actuarial and structured professional judgment components. So the actuarial components are normally checklists of tick box items, which are summed or scored in some other algorithmic fashion. And the scores are used to classify family and domestic violence cases into one of a set of risk categories, normally low, medium, or high risk, which in turn is used to drive how police and others respond to it. Now, the structured professional judgment component of these tools is, I guess, broadly speaking, intended to capture a more human impression or human judgment of these cases. So it typically captures the subjective impressions or the professional judgments of victims or officers or other professionals who are completing this tool. And really, they're used to either adjust actuarial risk ratings based on additional information that might not be captured as well as part of the actuarial component, or the information might be used to give a more nuanced view of risk, which can inform or further inform rather the responses that are implemented based on the actuarial risk ratings. Now, these tools, as I said, are now in widespread use across Australia and internationally. And these tools can succeed or fail in practice for many reasons, including how usable they are, whether those completing them have access to the information they need to complete them, whether the items make sense to those completing them, and whether they're consistently understood, and so on. But a critical element of the success or failure of a risk assessment tool is whether it accurately predicts what it says it does. And in research terminology, we refer to this as the predictive validity of the tool, the extent to which it predicts what it says it predicts. Now, there's a very large body of research now examining the predictive validity of various risk assessment tools for domestic and family violence and for other forms of crime. And this research sits alongside a growing body of research, which is taking a more data-driven approach to the simultaneous development and validation of risk assessment tools. So historically, risk assessment tools for domestic and family violence and for many other forms of crime have been, their development rather has been largely human-driven. So these tools typically consist of elements and items that are either seen to be important by the tool's developers or are known to be important based on prior empirical research. But in short, their development is very much human-driven. Data-driven risk assessment tools typically emerge from the analysis of sometimes hundreds of variables and possible risk factors using machine learning and other advanced modeling techniques. So the development of the tool is very much taken out of the hands of humans, and left to these statistical models. And the process of developing them includes obviously a validation component. So there's a simultaneous development and validation process going on there. But all of that research, the research looking at the predictive validity of human-driven tools and research that adopts a data-driven approach, really points to the importance of empirically verifying the predictive validity of these tools and ensuring, using rigorous scientific research that these tools are actually predicting what they say they do. Now, the basic approach in this research, be it the validation of human-driven tools or the validation of data-driven tools, is to compare rates of further violence between cases of family and domestic violence classified at higher and lower risk ratings on a tool. And I mean, if a tool is predicting what it says it predicts, then you would expect to see a higher rate of further violence among cases that are classified at higher risk. Now, this seems quite simple on the surface, but there is one complicating factor, and that's the importance of accounting for what happens after a risk assessment tool is actually completed in practice. So it's important to remember that these tools aren't completed just as a matter of bureaucratic process. They are actually used to inform and to drive responses. So usually after a risk assessment tool has been completed for a case or a report of domestic and family violence, things are done based on the risk assessment to lower that risk. So if we're examining data on these risk assessment tools as they're used in reality, then we need to account for these responses, because very likely they are altering the level of risk for a case in the wake of a tool being completed. And as a result, that's likely to have an impact on rates of further violence that we're seeing between cases at different levels of risk. So it's important to account for that in our modelling. Which brings us on to the research I've undertaken for the AIC. So in March 2017, ACT Policing rolled out their new, or what was new at the time, Family Violence Risk Assessment Tool, or the EFRAT. This is a tool that frontline officers completed for all reports of family and domestic violence here in the ACT, and it consisted of an actuarial component of 37 tick box items, which were scored and used to classify cases into low, medium, and higher risk ratings, along with a structured professional judgment component that captured the impressions and the professional judgments of the officers completing the tool. And as I said, the cases were classified into risk categories based on those cutoff scores specified there. Now, not long after the rollout of this tool, ACT Policing approached the AIC and expressed an interest in us undertaking a validation of their new tool. So our validation of the tool was essentially concerned with how well it predicted further domestic violence. We will focus specifically on intimate partner violence. That's what the tool was primarily being used for. There were a few reports of other forms of family violence that the EFRAT was used in, but we omitted those from our sample and just focused on reports of violence between current or former intimate partners. Now, the specific approach we took to examining this question involved us looking at whether victims in reports of domestic violence that received a high risk rating on the EFRAT were more likely to have any further contacts with police for domestic violence in the following 6 months. The reason we chose to focus specifically on re-victimization is because of the push here in the ACT and across Australia more broadly to improve responses to victims of domestic and family violence, and to ensure that protections are installed around them to reduce their likelihood of further re-victimization. And the reason we chose a relatively short follow-up period of 6 months was largely out of concern for the operational needs and priorities of police, who are concerned primarily, not solely, but primarily with short-term risk mitigation, at least in terms of the initial frontline response. So our data collection for this first study proceeded in 2 stages. The first involved a fairly manual data collection process, which involved a researcher being based at a police station here in Canberra and going through 350 domestic violence case logs, paper copies of domestic violence case logs, and recording the risk ratings for each case, and also certain details of the incident and a subset of police responses that were implemented in the wake of that report being received. So that gave us our initial baseline data on the domestic violence cases that we examined. Now, to obtain information on any further incidents of violence that came to the attention of police in the 6 months following that initial report, we worked with the statistics team in ACT policing to extract data on any further reports of domestic violence involving victims in one of those 350 initial domestic violence reports. I should point out as well that each of those 350 domestic violence reports involved a unique perpetrator and victim, so there was no overlap. And in terms of the overall rate of further violence, that sat at 11% for our entire sample. So in other words, 11% of those 350 cases saw further violence within the 6 months following the initial report. So how do we measure predictive validity? The most common metric for measuring predictive validity of risk assessment tools in research in this area it's a bit of a mouthful. It's the area under the receiver operating characteristic curve score, and there's a bit of an interesting backstory to that title, which I won't go into, but I'll just call it the area under the curve score for now. And it's basically a probability. Specifically, it's the probability that a randomly selected case where there was further violence received a higher risk rating on a given tool than a randomly selected case where there was no further violence. So being a probability, it's a value that ranges from 0 to 1, although in almost all instances it ranges from between 0.5 and 1. Anything below 0.5 basically means that a tool is doing the opposite of what it says it does, which is thankfully rare. But in most cases, you see tools with an area under the curve score of between 0.5 and 1. These are some thresholds that are commonly used by researchers to interpret the area under the curve score. They're not hard and fast thresholds, and there's no real science behind them. These are just thresholds that have been arrived at by consensus among researchers who examine risk assessment and risk assessment tools. So essentially anything between 0.5 and 0.59 is considered a little better than chance. So in other words, it's not much better than flipping a coin. Anything between 0.6 and 0.69 is okay. It's generally acceptable for use in the field, but you certainly wouldn't rely on it on its own. Anything between 0.7 and 0.79 is quite good, and anything over 0.8 is excellent. So the research on risk assessment tools for domestic and family violence generally shows that the ones currently in use in Australia and internationally sit between 0.65 and 0.75 in terms of their area under the curve score. So they're generally pretty good. They're better than chance, but again, you wouldn't rely on them on their own. Now, the area under the curve score is an overall measure of predictive validity, but it's important to point out that tools can predict the occurrence or non-occurrence of some future event with different levels of accuracy, which is a little counterintuitive, but just because they do one well doesn't mean they do the other well too. And in the context of domestic violence risk assessment tools, it's actually common for these tools to be better at predicting no further violence than at predicting further violence. Now, we obviously wanted to examine this as part of our validation of the FRAT, and there's a number of metrics that are commonly used to measure this, which we adopted in our research. And I've listed them here. So essentially, the sensitivity and the positive predictive value are concerned specifically with how well a risk assessment tool accurately predicts further violence, and the specificity and negative predictive values are concerned with how well a risk assessment tool predicts no further violence. Now, from a policing perspective, the sensitivity and the positive predictive value are particularly important, as these essentially tell you how many cases where further violence occurs are slipping through the cracks, so aren't receiving the higher risk ratings that they should be receiving. So, I mean, from a policing perspective, you want to see these as close to 100% as possible. But specificity and negative predictive values are also important. Low scores on these can mean that too many cases are being prioritised where they shouldn't be, which obviously has resource implications. So there's a balance there that needs to be achieved. Ideally, you'd want all of these values to be as high as possible, though. And going back to what I was saying before about the importance of controlling for responses implemented in the wake of a risk assessment tool being completed for a case, in the modelling that we used to examine the predictive validity of the FRAT, we included information on whether or not the perpetrator was arrested, whether charges were laid within the 6-month follow-up period, and how much time they spent in custody, either on remand or after being sentenced. So turning to the results, and this is just a quick overview of them, looking at how accurate the original 37-item FRAT was. Essentially, the results suggested that it wasn't a terribly good predictor of further violence. It had an area under the curve score of 0.6, which, if you remember, was kind of on the threshold of being either a poor to a moderate predictor. And when we compare the high and low risk categories specifically, so ignoring the medium risk category and just comparing the high and low risk categories, because this is where we see the biggest difference in terms of how police respond, the sensitivity and the positive predictive values were quite low, which essentially means that the tool wasn't performing terribly well in terms of predicting further violence. The specificity and the negative predictive values indicate that it was better at predicting no further violence, which is consistent with risk assessment tools in the domestic and family violence space more broadly. So, I mean, obviously these results were a little underwhelming, and we weren't terribly keen on going back to ACT policing just with those results. So we wanted to dig a little further into the data and look at, whether we could improve the tool in any way using a bit of a data-driven approach. So the questions that guided us in this exercise were, first of all, are there a subset of items within the 37 items that are on their own important and that maybe could be used to refine the FRAT into a shorter, more valid tool? And then how can we use scores on this subset of items to classify cases into low, medium, and high risk categories as accurately as possible? So as part of this, we went through and analysed each of the 37 items individually, and we identified 10 items that on their own were quite important to the prediction of further violence, which I've listed here. Broadly, these items reflect the severity of violence in the report, history of violence involving the victim and the perpetrator in the lead up to the report, and certain characteristics or circumstances of the relationship between the victim and the perpetrator, such as whether or not they've recently separated after cohabitating, a pregnancy or a new birth, recent pregnancy or a new birth, or whether or not they were experiencing money problems. So this gave us a refined 10-item tool, and we scored cases out of 10 on these 10 items. And we used a genetic algorithm that iteratively compares multiple cutoff points on a continuous scale to identify the optimal cutoff points for our low, medium, and high risk categories. And this resulted in thresholds in between a score of 2 and 3 and between a score of 5 and 6. So using all of this, we basically refined the original FRAT down to a 10 tick box item tool that we use to classify cases in the sample into low, medium, and high risk categories, low being those with a score of 0 to 2, medium being those with a score of 3 to 5, and high being those with a score of 6 and above. We then compared the performance of this refined tool to the performance of the original tool using the same sample. And I've just given you a figure here that compares these two tools on each of the predictive validity measures. As you can see, there was a substantial improvement in the area under the curve score, but crucially, there was substantial improvements in the ability of the refined tool to correctly predict further violence. So again, from a policing perspective, this is a particularly important, and overall the results bode quite well for the refined tool and its performance in practice. So on the basis of this first study, ACT Policing took our 10 items and used it to develop a refined tool. And they launched this tool in March of 2020. Now, the refined tool performed quite well in the sample that we used to develop it, but it's important in these instances to validate tools on a separate sample so that we can be confident of their performance outside of the sample that they used to develop it. So this is what we did with the second study. So we examined the predictive validity of the refined tool on a new sample of cases that were responded to by police in the ACT between March and December of 2020, which comprised the first 10 months of the refined tool's use in the field. Now, the refined tool that the ACT Policing eventually employed included a new section that asked victims to provide their own risk rating of low, medium, or high, independent of the actuarial rating. And this was used to capture further information on the severity of abuse and to further inform how police and others responded. Now, this gave us an interesting opportunity to examine whether victim perceptions of risk influence or add to the performance of actuarial ratings of risk. So we also examined those victim risk ratings as part of this follow-up validation as well, and I'll explain how we did that in a little more detail in a few minutes. Now, our modelling in this study included the same set of police responses. So the initial part of the analysis basically replicated the modelling that we ran in the first study so that we could directly compare the findings from this study to those of the previous study. But we also had the opportunity to collect information on a new set of police responses as part of our data collection for this research. This included whether police undertook any further investigation outside of their initial response, and also whether victims accepted a referral to any services that they received from ACT policing. So we included these as covariates in an expanded model that we ran as part of this research as well. And just finally, it's important to note that the observation period for this study ran over the first 10 months of the coronavirus outbreak here in the ACT. Now, here in the ACT, as in many other places across Australia, we experienced a number of lockdowns of varying intensity, which limited people's ability to publicly travel and operate. There's a very significant body of research showing that lockdowns here in Australia and internationally affected both rates of domestic and family violence and also the reporting of it to the police. So this obviously became important to control for in both sets of models as well. So we included COVID lockdowns here in the ACT as a covariate in our modelling examining predictive validity. So how accurate was this refined FRAT? So the light blue bar there reflects the results of the models that we ran, which replicated the model in the previous research, and the darker blue bar there reflects the results of the expanded model, which includes the additional police responses, and all models obviously include the COVID-19 lockdowns as well. So as you can see, looking at the replicated model first, the area under the curve score of 0.67 was lower than in the sample used to develop the refined tool, which is not it's not unusual when you're undertaking that further research. Many of the other predictive validity metrics remained relatively consistent, but there was a notable drop in sensitivity. When we included the additional covariates, looking at the results of the expanded model, the area under the curve score was slightly higher, 0.69. The other predictive validity metrics remained relatively consistent, but crucially, the sensitivity score increased from 57 to 63%, still lower than in the original sample, but slightly higher than the original FRAT tool. Now, as I said, we also wanted to look at victims' perceptions of risk and victims' risk ratings. So what we did here is we took the actuarial ratings and we adjusted them upward where there was a discrepancy between victim risk ratings and actuarial risk ratings. So for example, where an actuarial risk rating was low, but a victim risk rating for the same case was medium or high, then we adjusted it up to medium or high. And if an actuarial risk rating was medium, but the victim risk rating was high, then we adjusted it upward. So essentially, where victims rated the risk of a case higher than the actuarial rating, we took the victim's risk rating. And we examined these upward adjusted ratings using the same predictive validity metrics. And essentially what they show is that the area under the curve score, first of all, remained about the same. But the performance, or I guess the sensitivity score increased notably. So in other words, if we take victims' word and we adjust risk ratings upward based on their perception of risk, then we basically become better at anticipating further violence, but that comes at the expense of our ability to predict no further violence. So you can see drops there in specificity, positive predictive values, and the negative predictive value remained relatively consistent. So just to bring all this together quickly, essentially, this was an exercise in validating an existing tool and taking a bit of a data-driven approach to refining it, to narrowing it down. So in narrowing the FRAT down to its 10 most important items, we did manage to improve its overall predictive validity. essentially we saw an increase in its area under the curve score from 0.6 to about 0.67 to 0.7, which places it kind of within the middle of the range of many other domestic and family violence tools currently in use in Australia and internationally. Now, I didn't get much of a chance during this presentation to focus on the importance of accounting for police and other responses in validating these risk assessment tools, but you know, they did have an important effect on our modelling, and our results do suggest that it is important to account for these responses when validating risk assessment tools. Additionally, further examination of victim risk ratings on the refined FRAT highlight their utility in improving the prediction of when repeat domestic violence will occur in some cases, and this is consistent with research illustrating the validity of victims' own feelings and views on the threats they face from their current or former partners. But we do need to be careful, I guess, in assessing victim risk ratings against actuarial risk ratings, and there's a bit of a balance that police need to strike there. Now, just very quickly to finish, because I know this will lead into some of the other presentations for the seminar, there was a limited focus in our research on the prediction of further violence that came to the attention of police in the short term. So we're not picking up on violence that didn't come to the attention of police or longer term patterns of abuse. We weren't, unfortunately, able to validate the tool with specific subpopulations like Indigenous victims, cold victims, or those in same-sex relationships. Our numbers were just too small, and we weren't able to evaluate other elements of the tool, such as how it was used in practice and how the items were understood by officers. I'll wrap it up there, and I do apologise if I've gone a little over, but as I said at the start, both of these studies are published and publicly available on our website at aic.gov.au, so please do visit our website and read further if you're interested. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. One of the privileges of working at the AIC is that I get to see you present on this research, and I always have so many questions, even though I'm quite across the research. So thank you very much for that. Just to remind the presenters that you don't need to worry about sticking to time. We have enough time today, so just don't worry about rushing at all. Okay, so the next speaker is Dr. April Jolliffe-Simpson. So April is a lecturer at Te Puna Haumadu, the New Zealand Institute for Security and Crime Science at the University of Waikato in New Zealand. Her research focuses on decision-making in the context of crime using approaches from forensic psychology, crime science, and quantitative criminology. For her PhD, April examined the predictability, strengths and weaknesses of the risk assessments used by New Zealand Police and the multi-agency integrated safety response for family violence cases. So over to you, April.
Thank you, Hayley. It's a privilege to go next following up Christopher's excellent presentation. Tēnā koutou katoa, ko tongariro te maunga, ko te arawa te waka, ko tūwharetoa te iwi, I noho ana ahau I te taha o te awa o Waikato, ko April tōku ingoa. So that was the way that we traditionally introduce ourselves into Reo Māori in Aotearoa, New Zealand, just speaking to some of the places that we connect with and where we come from. So today what I'm going to do is talk to you briefly about some of the research that I've done with my colleagues looking at how our multi-agency integrated safety response assess risk for family violence cases. So we all know that each time a family violence related death is reported, as a society, we engage in collective soul searching. We ask ourselves what happened, was the family receiving any support, and most importantly, could we have seen this coming and intervened before it was too late? And in hindsight, reports often reveal many of those cases had previous contact with agencies responsible for intervening and prevented family violence. And that causes those agencies to look inward and search for ways to improve their decision making and prevent further harm or loss of life. What that means is in their roles, family violence practitioners are frequently required to make decisions that can have potential ramifications for families' wellbeing and safety. And so we try to use risk assessments and risk assessment instruments to help them make those decisions and improve their ability to do them well. So this has already been laid out for you, but traditionally when we're conducting risk factors, what we're doing is identifying and combining some kind of factors that have been associated with the outcome of interest. So we might have a list of risk factors that we combine using some kind of structured instrument, and that instrument uses an algorithm to tell us whether the risk assessment category for that case is currently at low, moderate, or high. And that's widely used in many different areas of the criminal justice system. In Aotearoa, New Zealand, we have various different ways of responding after the initial police response. So we have one police force and they respond to family violence cases throughout the country. But in the Waikato, which is the shaded area in the North Island where I live, and in the Canterbury region, which is the shaded area in the South Island, we also have an integrated safety response. And in these areas, every single case that comes to police attention is referred on to that integrated safety response for further risk assessment, triaging, and case management. So the response includes various different organisations, including our police, corrections, health, Oranga Tamariki, which is our Ministry for Children, as well as the Ministry for Social Development, Education, and the various NGO providers that are operating in each of the response areas. So what happens inside this integrated safety response is triage teams meet daily to discuss recent cases that have been reported in their catchment area, and they assess every single case that has come to police attention, regardless of what the initial police risk assessment was. And so together, the representatives from the different organisations come together. They bring the organisations the information that their organisation has about the people in question. So they go through their case files and see what's relevant that should be shared. And then they collaboratively identify risk factors and assess the likelihood and severity of future family violence. So they're thinking of risk factors, and then together they're saying, I think this is a low, I think this is a moderate, I think this is a high. And so this is purportedly structured professional judgment where they're coming together and making a decision. However, it's unclear whether the factors they're selecting are the basis for their overall risk categorization because they're not being combined using a structured instrument at the moment. And it's also not clear whether those factors are established risk factors because these are factors that they are identifying with their professional judgment rather than based on a tool that's been developed from data. So I had a few questions about how this process was working, really wanted to know how they're assessing risk and how well that's predicting what happens next. And that's part of us trying to learn from this process and see how we can improve it moving forward. So there were 4 aims of this research. The first was just to document the risk factors. What are they identifying and recording for these families? The next was to examine whether those risk factors were associated with what category of risk they were assigning to the cases. The next aim was to examine whether they were indeed risk factors. We're saying they are risk factors, but are they associated with what happens next? And finally, I wanted to examine the predictive validity of those risk categories. So when we're saying someone is high risk, is that doing what it should be? So to address these aims, we collected reports for family violence episodes that were reported in those 2 catchment areas, Waikato and Canterbury, in the first 2 weeks of November 2018. Next, we coded the risk factors that had been recorded for all the different cases. Can people see my slides? There's just a note in the chat about that.
Yes, we can see it.
Thank you all. So next we coded the risk factors that were recorded for each of those cases. Next, we recorded reports for what happened in the following 6 months. So we recorded where there were further calls for police service, which we called recurrence. And we also recorded whether there was physical recurrence, so whether there was any physical harm involved in any of those further reported incidents. And finally, we analysed the predictive validity. So just looking at our first aim first of documenting what the risk factors were, We found that there were 71 different risk factors being recorded, so a massive number, and they were really heterogeneous, and cases had different clusters of risk factors recorded. I can't summarize all of them, but I'll just speak to what the most common ones were. So they were things like verbal abuse, physical harm, family violence or a criminal history for the aggressor or victim, aggressor alcohol use, having a lack of information about what's going on, controlling behaviour being present, situational stress, separation, the aggressor using drugs, having unreported episodes going on, the aggressor having mental health issues, and also property damage occurring. Next, we wanted to know whether those risk factors that were being recorded were associated with the risk categories that were assigned to cases. And we found that looking at them, all 71 of them, just over half were associated with what was assigned to cases. So that's a good thing. The ones with the strongest relationship were things like non-fatal strangulation, physical harm, having that family violence or criminal history for the aggressor or victim, having unreported cases, the aggressor breaching or not complying with conditions or orders, victim fear, verbal abuse, frequent episodes, non-engagement with services, as well as threats, normalization, and controlling behaviour. So these were the things that had the greatest impact on what risk category the multi-agency triage teams were assigning to cases. There were also some risk factors that interestingly had no bearing, and I'm just going to highlight some of the ones that had no relationship with what category was assigned. So these were things like alcohol use for the aggressor, not having formal orders, so things like parenting orders to clarify the situation or give some ability to make decisions, mental health issues for the aggressor, people living together, so cohabiting, the aggressor denying or not accepting the end of a relationship, harassment, custody issues, the victim not being spoken to, having a protection order, experiencing financial stress, housing problems, and complex family dynamics. So it's interesting that these things being identified had appeared to have no bearing on what risk category was assigned, particularly financial stress and housing problems, which I'll talk about more later on. So next, I wanted to answer the question of, okay, we've said these are risk factors. Are they really? Are they helping us know what happens next? So to answer that question, we first looked at whether they were associated with whether there was a further call for police service, which we called recurrence. So just looking at recurrence first, here's the factors that had the strongest relationship with whether there was recurrence. So the first was having frequent episodes, having financial stress, having housing problems, non-engagement with services, aggressive drug use, controlling behaviour, escalation of behaviour, items being thrown, the victim having a family violence or criminal history, there being an on and off relationship, the victim having mental health issues, and the victim's drug use. So I think these are very interesting because they aren't necessarily the first thing that comes to mind always when we think of what the best risk factors are. And it was interesting also to see that financial stress and housing problems were right up there, but they weren't seeming to have an impact on what risk category was being assigned. There were also some factors that interestingly had a negative relationship with whether they were recurrence. And this was things like injuries, physical harm, and aggressor alcohol use. So this doesn't seem to make sense because you would think of these as risk factors, but what I think could be going on here is that when things like injuries and physical harm are present, that there is a response that means that we're not seeing recurrence being as likely. So we've got to remember here that this is in the context of a response occurring. So some of these things might be things that trigger us to intervene. And as well as that, I think aggressive alcohol use in the episode in question, it might have been a situational factor, maybe not as relevant to ongoing risk. On the other hand, it might also just be poorly recorded. So it really just raises more questions. Turning now to physical harm, we looked at whether any of those repeat episodes had physical violence, and we looked at what risk factors had the strongest relationship with that. So we found that, again, having frequent episodes and financial stress was associated with a greater likelihood of physical recurrence, as well as denying that family violence was occurring, the episode occurring in public, items being thrown, having an on and off relationship, having housing problems, escalation of behaviour, lack of information, non-engagement with services, normalisation of violence, unemployment, and victim suicide or self-harm. So again, really interesting findings, and not necessarily the factors that were making the biggest impact on our judgments. And again, we found aggressive alcohol abuse and custody issues were negatively associated with the likelihood of physical recurrence. So turning now to the final aim, which is to analyse the predictability of the risk categories overall. So earlier you heard Christopher Dowling talk about the AUROC curve. I'm going to visually show you the results. So what we do here is we plot the sensitivity against 1 minus specificity. So we're plotting the true positives against the false positives. And if we have just equivalent to chance prediction, it would be along that dotted line. And so if you had a line that looks like this, where it's closer to the top right corner, that means the instrument is performing better, or the assessment is performing better. So here's what we found for the ISR's risk assessments. So the AUC was about 0.6, so it was at that low end of the moderate range. So it's performing better than chance, but there's still some room for improvement. And one thing that was interesting is when we broke the assessments down to compare, just for example, intimate partner violence cases against non-intimate partner cases, which represent about 1/3 of the sample, you can see the intimate partner violence cases are still up there at around 0.6, but the non-intimate partner violence cases, the assessments were not performing statistically significantly differently from chance. So not doing so well in that area. So overall, the assessments were performing better than chance overall, and for intimate partner violence, regardless of whether it was current partners or former partners, better than chance for parents for predicting physical harm, and it was working for men, European men who were above 18 years. Below 18 years, it was only working for recurrence, but not physical recurrence, and it was working equally well in both of the ISR catchment areas. On the other hand, the instrument, or the assessment I should say, was not working better than chance for non-intimate partner violence cases, and for cases where the aggressors were the children of the victim, the sibling of the victim, or in other family violence relationships, and not working so well for parents when it came to predicting just recurrence rather than physical recurrence. Also wasn't working as well for women or Māori, and for people below 18 years when it came to predicting physical harm. It's important to understand that we probably won't ever get to the crystal ball. And here I've looked at predictability, but I've hinted to you that we need to do more work accounting for what interventions are happening in between, because these results could actually also show that we're doing a better job of intervening with some groups, but we just don't know that yet. So taking away from this, I think that we need to do further validation to perform more consistently for different groups of people, and to improve the validity of the instrument overall, or the assessment overall, like what's been done in the ACT. And I think the first place to start is to increase the structure that we use to combine these risk factors into categories. So it would be great if we could focus on the risk factors that do have the strongest association with the outcome, and use that to help us get to our risk categories, rather than only relying on our professional judgment. So thank you all for listening.
Thanks, April. Again, I have so many questions. That was really, really interesting. So thank you so much. Okay, on that note, let's have a look at the third presentation. Okay, so next up we have Min Tak Kim. Mintak Kim is a research manager at the New South Wales Bureau of Crime Statistics and Research. He has conducted a range of research projects in criminal justice, including projects aimed at understanding the impact of audio-visual link on bail, the effectiveness of programs delivered in custody through high-intensity program units on reoffending, and the recording of coercive control behaviours in domestic violence event narratives. So thank you very much, Mintak. And your slides are looking good.
Thank you. All right. So today I'm going to be talking about risk assessment in a slightly different way to the previous speakers. I'm going to go deep on this project where we were looking to develop a measure of coercive control using the, as Haley said, the event narratives from domestic violence narratives. But before I get onto that, I just want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, the Darug people, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and future. Okay, so I work at the New South Wales Bureau of Crime Statistics and Research. We provide a number of functions to New South Wales. So on the left, we've got the New South Wales Crime Tool, which shows, gives people the ability to look at different areas of New South Wales and look at the prevalence of different crimes and different offences happening in each region. And we also do research projects like the one I'm about to take you through. So we were asked to provide evidence, what we knew about coercive control for the Parliamentary Joint Select Committee way back in 2020. And they were particularly interested in the historical prevalence of coercive control. Why were they interested in coercive control? Coercive control, I guess first and foremost, is extremely harmful in and of itself. So this is a quote from Victoria's Royal Commission into Family Violence, really driving home the fact that coercive control as in domestic violence is extremely harmful and has long-term repercussions, and that many respondents to the Joint Select Committee felt that there was an overemphasis or over-fixation on physical assault and not on these kind of more difficult to observe sorts of violence towards people. The other reason that people were interested in coercive control was this idea that it could be a significant predictor. In the Joint Select Committee report, they call it a red flag for other types of domestic violence in the future. So the New South Wales Domestic Violence Death Review team looked at all the deaths that had happened in a domestic violence context between 2019 and 2021, and essentially find that all of them have some aspect of coercive control in the relationship. Haley has done some wonderful work looking at the experiences of coercive control among Australian women with Anthony Morgan. And there's a whole kind of literature that is very focused on understanding coercive control, partly as a predictor of future harm. Because the Joint Select Committee was looking to establish coercive control as a criminal offence, and it was not previously an offence, it wasn't clear where we could go to figure out what the historical prevalence of coercive control looked like. So we kind of went back and thought about, how can we capture coercive control somewhere? Can we find a data source where coercive control can be observed? And then can we kind of operationalize it and validate the measure? That was kind of the idea behind the project. So just to give people some background on coercive control. So coercive control describes an abusive pattern of behaviour predominantly perpetrated by men against women. It's quite hard to trace the history of this concept. So at least in the early 1980s, Susan Schechter is talking about coercive control, specifically using the words coercive control. And so that's in the early 1980s. She was a feminist scholar who established the first women's shelter in Chicago. And similar ideas, or very closely related ideas, were being discussed at the Domestic Abuse Intervention Project in Duluth. So you might have seen this power and control wheel around. And it's become kind of popularized more recently by Evan Stark with this book, Coercive Control. But I was reading yesterday that, in Australian law, people were talking about a system of tyranny within domestic relationships as early as the 1890s. So depending on what terms you use, closely related concepts have been around for quite a while. As you might expect from a long literature where people don't agree on much, there are a lot of different definitions in the literature, and the definitions of coercive control are defined in terms of, largely unobservable characteristics. And when I say unobservable, I mean, to me, the person who is trying to construct a measure of coercive control. So the three commonalities that Hamburger, Larsen, and Lerner come up with for coercive control is the intentionality and motivation within the abuser to obtain control, the perception of the behavior as negative by the victim, and the ability of the perpetrator to make credible threats. So very difficult for us to observe, and it explains why much of the literature has focused on self-report as a way of getting measures of coercive control prevalence, because it's very hard to think of what data set you could be able to get these things from. Obviously, so my reaction to this was to, call it a day, explain to the Joint Select Committee it couldn't be done, but I was told that maybe we should find another approach. So what we did was we went back to the literature and found that many people use behaviors as a proxy for coercive control. So instead of trying to establish that coercive control was or was not in place, you look for the behaviors that were happening, and if a sufficient number of behaviors take place, you use that as a proxy for whether coercive control is taking place in the relationship. So that's what we did. Many of the scholars are pretty adamant that you shouldn't use a set of behaviors, that coercive control can't be reduced to a set of behaviors. But thankfully, Evan Stark does provide a list of 48 behaviors in his book that are associated with coercive control. This isn't the full list, but you can see the 6 kind of main categories and some of the subcategories that sit under these. And what we did was we focused on trying to pick these up, or trying to detect these. And we tried to detect them using a text mining approach. So this isn't the large language models that have been around in the news lately. This is a approach that uses dictionaries and rules. So the rules identify common structures for each behavior in the text, and then the dictionaries let you kind of swap in and out pronouns and verbs in order to make sure that a large number of configurations can be caught. So you can see here that it says, refuse to let him in the house. That would be a phrase for premise lockout. This could also then capture refuse to let her in the house and refuse to let him in the home, depending on how the dictionaries and the rules have been set up. So my co-author, George Karasianis, went through and has kind of manually crafted tons of these rules and dictionaries and made sure that they all make sense. Essentially kind of going through this painstaking task of devising a rule, seeing what gets picked up, seeing what doesn't get picked up, devising new rules, devising new dictionaries, and kind of iterating and checking the results to make sure that this is effective. Where did we apply this text mining system? So we applied our text mining method to all police narratives, or I should say of domestic violence events in New South Wales between 2009 and 2020. So can be a little tricky to describe this in numbers because of the different units of counting, but I think of it as roughly 500,000 events, which involve 220,000-ish persons of interest, or persons of interest, and about 55,000 of those persons of interest go on to reoffend within 12 months. So each event can contain multiple incidents, and each event can have multiple persons of interest. What does our text mining system look like? This is a fake narrative in the sense that I've edited it to make sure that all details have been removed, but essentially when police go out to domestic violence events, they will write down a sometimes long, sometimes short description of what has happened at the event, and then our text mining system goes through and evaluates each chunk of words, each snippet of words, to see if it matches one of the rules that has been crafted by George. So you can see here that was going to assault her matches our intimidation to harm. The accused sent the victim numerous text messages, lines up with harassment brackets message, and so forth. You can see here that began to kick her vehicle numerous times has not been picked up by our system. So the point I want to make here is that our system, we're pretty confident that the ones that do get picked up are definitely the coercive control behaviors that we're looking to detect. We're less confident that it picks up every single instance in the system. Sorry, not in the system, in the narrative. Okay, so just to recap, what we've ended up doing is we've defined a set of coercive control behaviors using the examples given by Stark. Then we've looked at police narratives of domestic violence events where the behaviors that are described. That's the data source that we've used to develop our measure. And then finally, we have used our text mining system in order to detect these coercive control behaviors. Okay, so what did we find? We found that the vast majority of coercive control of narratives had at least one coercive control behavior. So you can see that quite a lot of them, almost 30-odd% of them, just over 30-odd% of them have one behavior. 82,000 have two behaviors, and so on. And most of those behaviors are property damage and theft, intimidation and threats, and verbal abuse. So I just want to make the point here that this is, almost certainly an underestimate of the coercive control behaviors that are in each narrative, and an even larger underestimate of the coercive control behaviors that are taking place within these relationships, because we're limited by what is observed, what is recorded, and then finally what is captured by our text mining system. Nevertheless, we were able to capture coercive control behaviors at a quite a high level of granularity. So you can see here that this is the breakdown of harassment behaviors detected by the subcategory within everything that's harassment behaviors. You've got all these instances of people calling, using the phone to harass people, messaging people, stalking them, harassing them in a kind of more generic way, trespassing, using emails, unwanted gifts, stalking at location, using social media. We're able to pick these up in a pretty granular way, which is helpful for us in terms of future research projects, but also helpful for understanding the kinds of behaviors that we're observing in domestic violence events. And then what we did with this measure is that we threw all of these measures into a prediction model, and we looked to predict domestic violence reoffending using either just the text mining variables, what I'm calling the standard predictors, which includes age, gender, prior offending, all the variables that we would normally use to predict domestic violence within a reoffending data set, and then what the prediction looks like using with both sets included. To do this prediction, we used a gradient boosted model, which is a machine learning approach, simply because we had a large number of predictors and we had 500,000 events as our data set. It was kind of the most efficient or effective method that we could think of, but it also has the problem that they're quite difficult to interpret. So what we've done is we've just estimated the model 3 times. The first time with just the text mining variables, the second time with the standard predictors, and then the last time with both sets of data included. So thankfully, Chris and April have gone through and kind of explained some of these measures, but recall here, or sensitivity as it's sometimes known, is what proportion of future reoffenders are captured by the model correctly. So you can see here that both the model with just the standard predictors and the model with both sets included, about half of them are correctly predicted to go on to reoffend. And the precision here is the proportion of people that we predict to go on to reoffend, what proportion of them actually go on to reoffend. And you can see that the proportion is actually quite low. So it guesses quite a large number of people will reoffend, and only kind of 16 to 17% actually go on to reoffend, given that given the prediction for both the model with standard predictors and the model with both sets included. And then finally, accuracy. Accuracy just tells you what percent the model gets right or wrong. You can see that the accuracy of the model is essentially identical for the model with standard predictors and both sets included. The model with just text finding variables does okay at 71%, but it's substantially lower than the others. For those who are curious, this translates to a model with an AUC of about 83%. So it's performing pretty well. The main thing we took away from this study is that including coercive control, our measures of coercive control were not helpful in improving the predictions of our model. And the reasons for that are, I guess pretty difficult to figure out. So there's a lot happening. There's a lot of steps taking place between the coercive control taking place within the domestic violence relationship and way down at the bottom where our coercive control behavior measure is predictive of the reported future domestic violence. So first you need to have the coercive control behaviors kind of observed at the event for us to have a chance. Then after that, in the narrative, it actually has to be reported, so where it's unclear which behaviors are being reported and why by police. Then the behavior has to be captured by our text mining system effectively. And then that measure has to be predictive of domestic violence offending in the future. But not only that, it has to be predictive of the future domestic violence offending that's actually reported to police. So you can see that there's kind of a lot of places where we can be losing information here. So, it's hard to jump to conclusions about what is happening or, what it means for our measure, given all these steps where we're losing information. And this isn't specific to coercive control. So, I just guess trying to bring it all together. We found it hard to improve on the well-known predictors of domestic violence. So, age, gender, prior offending are kind of the major ones that we find, with some detail around how you capture each of these. These characteristics have the advantage of being kind of reliably observable for the sample you're looking at. They tend to be strongly predictive. And, for a new predictor to help us to substantially improve our predictions for domestic violence offending, it would have to the information it would be providing would have to not overlap with the information provided by existing predictors. So, I guess, maybe this isn't the most kind of satisfying ending to the story, but, what we found is that coercive control is a measure that can be helpful in prediction. And there's a whole body of literature that obviously suggests that coercive control is very, very important for understanding domestic violence. But it's another thing to go from that understanding of coercive control and then translate it through, your risk assessment processes all the way through to prediction. Anyway, thank you.
Thanks, Mintak. How great is research? I just have to say, the first 3 presentations have just been so interesting and so different in terms of the lens that has been applied to risk assessment, but also the research itself. So I'm just really jazzed on research right now, I have to say. So thank you so much for that presentation. It was so interesting. Okay, so next up, we have another fabulous presenter, Professor Silke Meyer. So Professor Silke Meyer is the Leanan Ford Chair in Child and Family Research in the School of Health Sciences and Social Work at Griffith University, and she's also an adjunct at the Monash Gender and Family Violence Prevention Centre. Silke is a criminologist and a social worker, so she's numerous different threats by training, and bringing practical and theoretical expertise to her research, training and advocacy. Her research centres on different aspects of domestic and family violence, including women and children's safety, well-being and recovery, men's accountability in their role as perpetrators and fathers, and the role of domestic and family violence informed practice in child protection, policing, court proceedings, health and education. She is an internationally recognised expert in holistic and collaborative service responses to individuals and families affected by domestic and family violence, including evidence-based policy and practice reform. And at the end of that very impressive and terrifying bio, I'll hand it over to you, Silky. And your slides look great.
Thanks. Thanks. Slides are working. Okay. Well, we'll see how we go, because this now looks different to what we tested the other day in the slideshow. Thank you, everybody, for the opportunity to join this webinar today. I'll be coming from a slightly different angle to the previous fabulous presenters. There'll be less prediction of risk in my presentation. We focused on identifying who identifies DV perpetration across different service systems in the first place, and what facilitates identifying DV perpetration and responses in terms of support mechanisms, referral pathways, but then also risk management and risk identification. So before I start talking more about the actual study, I also want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands from which everyone's joining today. For me, that's the Yagara and Turrbal people in Mianjin and Brisbane, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people on the webinar stream today, and recognise that this land always has been, always will be Aboriginal land. So just by a little bit of background, our focus was on screening for potential DV perpetration across different types of service settings. And part of that work came out of, I guess, what we've already heard about from the previous presenters around risk predictors, particularly in death review mechanisms at the pointy end of domestic and family violence or intimate partner violence, and recognizing that DV perpetration tends to intersect with a number of other presenting issues, including mental health presenting issues, drug and alcohol or problematic substance use, other criminality, parenting issues or child protection involvement, at times housing instability and homelessness. So the Death Review Board mechanisms across Australia, I guess, have repeatedly identified that there is multiple opportunities to identify DV perpetration earlier on, but also often multiple missed opportunities in the context of service system contact that responds to intersecting presenting issues without necessarily asking additional questions to identify the potential intersection with DV perpetration and related risks this may pose for other family members in the background, along with support needs and referral pathways that may be able to be created for the male service user across a number of generalist service systems. In terms of the intersecting issues, and I guess these are fairly straightforward and they don't just apply to the adult intimate partner violence space, we know that these intersecting issues tend to be present across broader forms of domestic and family violence, including child-to-parent violence, adult child-to-parent violence, extended family violence, young people's use of violence in the home or in their dating relationships. So we know that there's a high likelihood that the use of violence in family or intimate relationships tends to intersect with other issues, as I said, criminality, mental health problems, drug and alcohol use, housing instability, other kind of health presentations, contact with courts or other legal support mechanisms. So plenty of opportunities where people are visible to service systems, but where their use of violence may not necessarily be disclosed immediately or visible to practitioners working with male service users. So I just want to quickly acknowledge and provide an overview of the wider project. So the project was funded by the Australian Institute of Criminology under its CRG rounds. And it involved some of my Monash colleagues, Dr. Nicola Helps, Professor Kate Fitzgibbon, and also Dr. Tess Bartlett. And we initially had a wider kind of national focus, not nationally representative. We circulated our online survey and invitation for focus groups via a number of different peak bodies, newsletters, social media channels. And we had the largest uptake in Queensland, because in Queensland we were also able to seek research approval from a number of different government departments, followed by Victoria. And so as you can see, we had over 400 participants in the survey from Queensland, followed by 70 practitioners from Victoria, and 81 combined across the other states. So I won't be talking about any of the other states today. And in terms of the key findings, that we focused on the Queensland data. I will touch on some of the Victorian findings, just in terms of some of the learnings from the specialist practitioners' roles across different kind of service settings. So key questions for today, there's additional research questions we answered in the Trends and Issues papers and the full report, which is available via the AIC website. But the key questions for today are really, what are some of the key barriers to identifying and responding to DV perpetration, and what are some of the enablers of identifying and responding to DV perpetration across service settings that are non-specialist domestic violence service settings, and what implications does this then raise for practice, and I guess also organizational support. I just want to quickly start with this overview, because specialist training, access to specialist training, availability, support for practitioners accessing specialist training will come up repeatedly throughout the presentation. So just to give you an overview, among the Queensland practitioners, which included AOD and mental health that fall under the Queensland Health umbrella, child protection practitioners, and corrections practitioners. We had almost a third that said they had received no training on DV whatsoever, and that includes no internal professional development, induction sessions, or anything like that. Followed by about a third that said they had undertaken some form of short course, followed by professional development, and then relatively small proportions, which is probably not surprising or uncommon, of actual standalone units or even postgraduate, complete postgraduate units or degrees, which is often more common for practitioners that work in the more specialized settings as opposed to the non-specialist service system responses. We asked, and I'm not going to present any statistics, graphs, or anything. If you're interested in the actual ANOVA tables or anything, feel free to access the report or the Trends and Issues paper. I just want to talk about some of the predictors that came out of the quantitative side of the survey, and then bring in the qualitative feedback that practitioners provided in their open-ended feedback. So really, in terms of factors supporting proactive screening and risk assessment practices, the key things were that staff had access to specialized training, that DV was promoted as core business within the organization, by the organization, and by leadership and staff across the organization. And that created an authorizing environment to make DV core business in frontline practice, which requires, having the time to ask additional questions, digging deeper, asking curious questions, unpacking things, but then also working out what some of the risk and safety concerns are, and what some of the support needs and referral options might be. And in terms of specialist training, I guess the things that emerged were specialist training around victimization as well as perpetration, although practitioners who had access to specialist DV training rated their confidence and their ability to respond to victim survivors higher than to perpetrators. So that was certainly and I think we've seen that with the implementation of routine screening practices across different kind of practice areas. For example, for victimization, particularly with female service users, practitioner awareness and confidence has certainly grown a lot in recent years in that victimization space, and is lagging behind in the perpetration space, even among the practitioners that had received significant specialist training, including comprehensive access to the Safe and Together training, for example. The other thing that was reiterated by staff in the survey and also the focus groups was the importance of initial training, but also ongoing access to training, partly to recognize that the evidence base is ever changing, and partly to recognize that in some ways, particularly in the child protection space, for example, we're talking about organizations with relatively high staff turnover. So saying at the beginning of a year, you've trained most of your frontline practice base isn't good enough if we recognize that a significant proportion of that frontline practice base by 6 months into the year has turned over, left, or moved into different positions. We also examined what, so amongst the practitioners that said for them, DV was organizational core business, or for the organization they worked in, DV was promoted as core business. These practitioners were more likely to say that they had had access to specialist DV training, not just training they had done prior to their role on their own, but also promoted and made available by their organization. They were more likely to screen consistently for DV perpetration in intake assessments and repeat client contact. They felt they were more likely to identify DV perpetration when actually asking certain kind of questions. They were more likely to consistently then also conduct risk assessments when DV had been identified. And they were more likely to say that while generally practitioners had a sense that identifying perpetration may be harder than victimization because perpetrators are more likely to deflect, deny, minimize, or lie. Those practitioners where DV was promoted as core business felt that routine screening is still important and able to detect risk and identify relevant support needs, even if we know that perpetrators may be more likely to minimize or deny their perpetration behavior. So I just I'm not going to read out all the individual quotes. I just want to go through some of these because they highlight, I don't know why sometimes the screen isn't moving. There we go. So just in terms of highlighting again, when practitioners provided qualitative open-ended feedback, both child protection and mental health here highlighted again the role of domestic violence as core business within their organizations, and really highlighting that where there's environments, and that was not limited in the first quote to child protection, mental health said very similar things in terms of when environments operate under fast-paced, under-resourced, high-pressure environments, where there's a get in, get out as fast as you possibly can, because you know how big your caseload is as a practitioner, that significantly hinders screening for identification and then risk assessment for domestic and family violence. And practitioners across these non-specialist settings certainly recognize the need for screening and the opportunity, knowing that, for example, mental health concerns tend to intersect with use of domestic violence and other presenting issues, recognize the opportunity their practice space offered to screen for DV perpetration and then related safety concerns and support needs, but equally felt that without organizational leadership, to really make this a priority, it would always remain a secondary concern. And if you can only get to so much in your initial client contact, you'll focus on the priority business, which many said our priority business is mental health. Practitioners spoke about the role of DV-informed leadership. And again, you can see the different kind of practice areas, but not so much different concerns or responses in terms of mental health practitioners, corrections practitioners, and child protection practitioners, all describing the importance of and the benefits, and practitioners who felt they had DV-informed leadership and leadership that promoted responding to DV and identifying DV as core business. Those practitioners felt they were operating in a space where they were giving an authorizing environment. They were giving the kind of space to ask more questions, ask curious questions, dig a little deeper, maybe consult with other colleagues or in organizations that had a DV specialist practitioner with a DV specialist practitioner, to kind of, sometimes in the absence of standardized screening tools, to dig deeper and follow their gut feeling that if they felt something was wrong, they had the authorizing environment to explore that further and potentially bring in a colleague to figure out what's happening in a particular case, and if DV is identified, what the follow-on effect from that is in terms of risk assessment and referral pathways. In that context, practitioners, again, pretty much across the different practice areas, talked about the need for a DV-specific assessment tool. This was primarily in relation to the screening for DV perpetration, but to some extent also in a risk assessment tool. The practice area spoke about their risk assessment tools, or their priority tools, I guess. Queensland does have a standard risk assessment framework, so in theory, everybody has access to a standard DV-specific risk assessment tool. That may be victimization focused rather than perpetration focused, but at least there are questions that are standardized questions across the board. But practitioners felt that when they work with their male service users, regardless of whether that's mental health, child protection, or corrections, their risk assessment tools focused on practice area specific risk assessment of harm to children in the child protection context, of risk of self-harming behaviors or suicide in the mental health context, or risk of reoffending more broadly in the corrections context. So practitioners were saying it would certainly be good to have specific assessment tools that really just make screening for and risk assessing for DV second nature, and not something I have to think of in addition to the standard practice risk assessment tool we're using. Practitioners also spoke about the role of professional judgment, which is probably not surprising in terms of what we know from the victim survivor screening and risk assessment space, and that there's always, I guess, kind of the conversation about, yes, we need standardized risk assessment questions, but we also need practitioners who are DV informed, who have the specialist knowledge and the skills to use professional judgment where they feel that a risk assessment tool may only do so much or may only identify a certain level of risk, but because they have certain additional knowledge or understanding of the particular service users, the family dynamics or the family situation, that they have an opportunity to explore risk further beyond some of the standardized questions. But practitioners across the different practice areas, again, in terms of, here we've got an AOD practitioner, but in general, the health, the child protection and the corrections space, spoke about the importance of, and I think, again, a lot of this goes back to practitioners feeling that they didn't have a specialist DV screening and risk assessment tool. So they use their own intake screening questions and their own risk assessment tools unique or specific to their practice area. And then have to think beyond that in conversation with service users, or whether people are saying things or disclosing things or touching on things, or making comments about the other party, for example, in terms of the victim survivor and victim blaming, that practitioners felt they had to overly rely on professional judgment in the absence of some of the standardized DV-specific screening questions. And I guess going back to what I spoke earlier, using that professional judgment requires significant understanding, skills, training, experience to explore things further and to ask curious questions and to often ask uncomfortable questions when we're talking about working with perpetrators of domestic and family violence. So there was a bit of a challenge in terms of people recognize the importance of professional judgment, but professional judgment also requires organizations to equip their staff with the ability to exercise professional judgment. And if you think back to how limited the specialist training access was amongst the cohort, that obviously raises some concerns. And I think finally, one of the things that came out was the the idea that everybody kind of recognized the importance of their practice area focusing more on identifying DV perpetration and related risk and related support needs. But some also felt that it's not, or I mean, I guess we know it's not an individual system response, but I think in some of the spaces, practitioners felt that, you know, we can do whatever we like and we can do as much great practice as we like. If the service system isn't equipped to share risk management and monitoring, to hold risk holistically, and to offer referral pathways to a diverse client population. And very often that's, won't go into too much detail, but if you read the report, you'll see there were a lot of challenges around the referral pathways available for male service users using domestic violence to start with, and in particular when we're talking about unique populations, whether that's men with significant mental health issues, men with housing instabilities, men with problematic substance use, men with acquired brain injuries, culturally and linguistically diverse service users, First Nation service users. So the concern that there isn't enough for men using violence out there in general, but there certainly aren't enough referral pathways available for men who have diverse or unique needs based on their presenting issues or their identity, for example. So just to wrap up, really, I think what came out of the findings was that one of the biggest or strongest facilitating factors for screening and risk assessment as a consistent practice when it comes to potential users of violence was organizational commitment to domestic and family violence as core business, to create an authorizing environment for frontline practitioners in non-specialist service systems to consistently screen, and where identified, to consistently then conduct risk assessments with service users. And as you saw, the screening and risk assessment in particular, to ensure consistent screening and risk assessment and DV-informed screening and risk assessments, practitioners need to have access to initial and ongoing professional development around DV specialist training. And then I think the final thing to bring it back together for practitioners across these different service settings really was the recognition that this is a whole of service system response. It's not one service area that has an opportunity to identify and refer, and then hope for the best once male service users are referred out of that specific system, but really the recognition that it is a whole of system responsibility to make DV identification, DV perpetration identification, responses and referral pathways core business across the service system. Thank you.
Thank you, Silky. That was fascinating and really taps into, I think, those missed opportunities that we have in terms of assessing risk in non-law enforcement and criminal justice settings. Okay, so we have one final presentation and then we'll go into the Q&A section. And I love research and I love hearing people talk about research, and I'm really excited to introduce Samantha Venner. So Sam is a provisional psychologist currently in her final year of her PhD at Swinburne University. Samantha's doctoral research focuses on cross-cultural risk assessment, particularly on the suitability of risk instruments for use with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, African and Pacific Islander peoples in Australia. So really picking up on a lot of the, I guess, questions that our other panelists had about the cultural sensitivity of some of the risk assessment processes that we currently have in place. And on that note, I'll hand over to Sam. Thank you, Sam. And your slides look good.
Great. Thanks so much, Hayley, and good morning, everyone. So as Hayley said, I'm going to talk a little bit today about the area of cross-cultural risk assessment, which is the use of risk assessment tools with people who are not from white or Western cultural backgrounds. So before I start, I'd like to acknowledge both the traditional custodians of the land on which Swinburne's campuses are located, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation in Melbourne, and the traditional custodians of the land from which I'm speaking to you today, which are the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. And I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. So as I said, my topic is cross-cultural risk assessment, and this is a pretty broad research area, and quite honestly, it can be one that raises more questions than it does answers. So in the interests of trying to distill it into 20 minutes, I've kind of conceived of this as a bit of a crash course in cross-cultural risk assessment. So we'll start by sort of giving a very brief overview of structured risk assessment, and Chris kind of helped us out with his presentation at the beginning. And then we'll go through some of the research at the moment on this topic of cross-cultural risk assessment, some of the research I've been doing in this space, and then some of the implications and conclusions about what this all actually means. All right, so as we know, there are decades of research that support the use of structured instruments to estimate risk of recidivism, as opposed to using a professional's purely unstructured professional judgment. And these instruments, as Chris told us earlier, usually take one of two forms or a combination of both, the first being actuarial tools, which assign offenders to risk groups via an algorithm based on the presence or absence of risk factors which have been empirically demonstrated to be related to reoffending. An example being the LS-RNR, which is an instrument for general recidivism. And then we have structured professional judgment tools, which allow clinicians to determine a risk level using their judgment, but based on guidance and a list of these empirically validated risk items. An example of that might be the HCR20, which is a violence risk instrument. And oftentimes these instruments include two kinds of risk factors. So the first is static risk factors. These are sort of historical factors that cannot be changed, not amenable to treatment, and that's something like your criminal history, your history of perpetration. And then we also have dynamic risk factors, and these are the risk factors that can be changed and therefore can be targeted in an intervention. And 7 of the sort of the most common ones, and the ones that in the literature we refer to as the central 8 when we add in the criminal history, are education, employment, leisure, recreation, family, marital, substance use, criminal or antisocial companions or peer associations, pro-criminal attitudes, and antisocial behaviour patterns. And so the idea is that if you have an instrument that incorporates both of these kinds of factors, you can both predict the likelihood of reoffending, and you can use it as a guide to your treatment intervention supervision because it will outline treatment targets through these dynamic risk factors. And these dynamic risk factors are essentially intended to be a representation of what causes offending behaviour. And they're also intended to generalise across age, gender, offending types, and culture. And this is where things get a little bit tricky and where the cross-cultural risk assessment literature kind of comes in. And it's tricky because the majority of these risk tools are normed on predominantly Western or white populations. And as we know, if you have a tool that's trying to predict something, so recidivism in this case, you want it to have been normed on a representative sample, so you can use it with everyone you want to use it with. So it's understandable that researchers are questioning whether a tool, for example, the LS-RNR, which is normed in North America, should be applied with, for example, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here in Australia. So as such, several studies have kind of examined the use of risk instruments cross-culturally. And generally speaking, there have been 3 kind of major trends. So the first is that Black, Indigenous and people of colour tend to receive higher scores on risk instruments. Now, this is not necessarily a problem with the risk assessment, and I think this is an important thing to highlight. What this is essentially telling us is that people from these populations are presenting with a higher amount or a higher rate of risk factors, which actually, in all likelihood, is accurate, unfortunately. And what this may better reflect to us is a kind of more systemic issue among these populations than actually a problem with the instruments themselves. However, the researchers also found that these instruments are predictive of recidivism, so that's good. However, at a reduced accuracy when compared to offenders from white Western cultures, and also that Black, Indigenous and people of colour are more regularly misclassified on these risk instruments. And that is troubling when we consider that it's the risk classification. So if they're high risk, medium risk or low risk, that will determine usually what sort of interventions and support they get, and sometimes too, especially in other countries, their sentence. And we found these results sort of across the board for African American people, Native American, Canadian, Indigenous, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here in Australia, and culturally and linguistically diverse populations in Australia as well. So on the back of these findings, most of the research recently has been trying to understand why these differences exist. And there are numerous theories that are being explored. We don't have time to go through them all today, so I'm just going to talk briefly to two of the ones that I've done a little bit of research on. The first one is this idea of rater bias or rater cultural bias. And I'll only speak to this briefly because there's actually not a lot of research on it at the moment. So rater bias essentially refers to the idea that these instruments could be susceptible to any kind of cultural bias, be it conscious or unconscious, that an assessor or a rater might hold. So what does the research say? Why do we think this could be a problem? So we know that humans are prone to a number of cognitive biases. We know that our brains interpret information based on our own experiences and beliefs. And we also have found that there's evidence that other types of rater biases or rater variances can impact risk assessment. So there's a phenomenon that's been observed predominantly in North America called adversarial allegiance, which is where risk scores and ratings will change depending on whether the clinician is working for the prosecution or for the defense. We also know that the inter-rater reliability of these tools is not perfect. That's to be expected, it never is. But I did a lit review a few years ago, and we found that these items, or the risk items with the lowest inter-rater reliability, also tend to be the ones that have the most differential scoring or the least predictive accuracy for Black, Indigenous and people of colour. And that kind of invites this question about potential cultural biases. Unfortunately, though, at the moment, there's very, very little research on this idea of cultural bias in risk assessment. Existing studies at the moment haven't found evidence for rater cultural bias, which is good. However, I think we need to be doing a lot more research in this space. The second theory that's been posed, and the second one that I've been doing my doctoral studies on, is this concept that I've kind of called, for today's purposes, risk factor suitability. It goes by a lot of names in the literature, stuff like item content, item bias, construct bias. But it essentially refers to two things. So the first is that the risk factors that we have included in our instruments, so for example, the central 8 that I mentioned before, may not be representing or measuring the same thing for people from non-Western white cultural backgrounds, given that they are normed on Western populations. And the second is that there might be culturally specific risk factors that are not being captured in existing research. And what do we know about this so far? Well, there's some emerging research that suggests that this could be at least part of the problem. And so my doctoral research has focused essentially on this. Specifically, we've examined the use of the LSRNR being a sort of actuarial tool for general recidivism that uses those central 8 risk factors with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander offenders and with African Australian offenders. We're also currently doing this study with Pacific Islander and Māori offenders too. And the reason we chose these populations is because they are all very much overrepresented in the justice system in Australia, as I think most of us probably know. So we've conducted a sort of series of qualitative studies interviewing justice workers from these cultural backgrounds about the suitability of the LSRNR, the risk and protective factors they feel are relevant for these communities, and sort of their ideas and advice on conducting risk assessments with these populations. So we've got a lot out of these studies. They've produced a lot of themes. Unfortunately, we can't go through them all. We'll be here all day. But some of the most interesting, I think, would be good to discuss today. So firstly, participants agreed that the central 8 risk factors are relevant to and do predict risk in these populations, and that they often present as at higher frequencies, which is good. That's consistent. Well, it's not good, but it's consistent with the existing research. However, one of the major critiques of the instrument is that it lacks cultural contextualization. And so they noted that the instrument does not invite clinicians to consider specific cultural examples of risk and protective factors. So, for example, when we were talking to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander justice workers, they noted that things like knowledge of cultural law, cultural wisdom aren't captured in the education and employment factor. When we were talking to all the participants, they were talking about sort of the family marital factor not really capturing like non-Western conceptions of extended family. It's a very nuclear kind of framework. And they noted that because these tools don't invite these considerations, the onus is placed on the clinicians and their level of cultural competency to be mindful of these considerations. And they also noted that the instrument does not invite clinicians to consider why members of these populations are presenting with high risk scores. So, for example, if you have a person who is lacking in education, but they're an African person who's come through a refugee pathway, or they're an Indigenous person who has lived in a remote community. And this topic I'm going to return to in a minute. So secondly, they kind of identified a number of these possible culturally specific risk factors. So some examples were for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, this idea of intergenerational trauma, which is the continuing impacts of colonisation and separation from land and family. And for the African Australian group, they identified this idea around sort of confused cultural identity and a lack of feeling like they belong in Australia, having difficulty kind of reconciling the norms from their collectivist cultural background with the norms of our sort of more individualistic culture here in Australia. And thirdly, they noted that existing treatment programs and community supports are derived from Western models. And this is true when we think about it. If we know that sort of these treatment programs are derived from the same models that underpin our risk assessment, stuff like the R&R model, the risk need responsivity model. These are all kind of normed within a Western framework. And so participants were advocating for culturally specific programs and frameworks to be developed, and emphasise that this needs to be done in consultation with members from these communities. So what does this actually mean? How can we actually contextualize this information and use it? So I think firstly, we need to unpack a little more this idea that the participants were talking about of cultural contextualization. So essentially what we're saying here is that these risk factors, the central 8, probably all others, have cultural nuances to them, which is reasonable. However, whilst they may be culturally sort of nuanced, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not predictive of risk. So that is to say, the reasons as to why somebody presents highly on a risk item, so for example, they've had a lack of opportunity to engage with education, arguably does not make the risk factor more or less predictive of risk. And indeed, if we think about the purpose of risk assessment instruments, we are generalizing to individuals, and that is the framework we're working in. And if we begin to consider why a risk factor is present and allow this to influence how we score, we might actually undermine the whole framework that we're working in. And if we do want to be considering why, if we think this is important, particularly in the cross-cultural space, maybe we actually need to be changing the whole framework we're working in, which is a big deal, or we need to be thinking about it a little bit differently. So in that sense, I mean, maybe what we are actually saying is we need to take a step back, and we're arguing that there are actually different causes of criminal behaviour across cultures. So as I said earlier, we know that these dynamic risk factors are kind of conceptualised as causal of crime, and we know they're derived from Western norms. What we actually don't know, and there's not a lot of research on, is whether the causes of criminal behaviour are the same or similar across cultures. So maybe that's where the research needs to focus. One caveat to that might be the family marital item. I think this is one where it is really good for clinicians to be taking a cultural lens and really thinking about this, not through our sort of Western nuclear idea of a family, but thinking about sort of extended family and kinship relationships that exist in other cultures. But aside from that, given that the LSRNR is what it is currently, as are all the other sort of risk instruments that we use here in Australia, we may be better off thinking about these cultural considerations in terms of our risk assessment interview process, so the kinds of questions that we're asking, the way we're asking them, and also in terms of our treatment and management, rather than the actual risk prediction, at least at the moment, until we have a little bit more research in that space. So furthermore, consistent observations and findings that these risk factors present at greater frequency among these populations suggest that it potentially is a little bit more prudent to be addressing the systemic issues that are causing these risk factors to emerge at high rates among these communities, rather than towards changing the predictive risk instruments, at least at this stage. Of course, that is easier said than done, but I think if you follow this research through, that kind of does become the crux of the issue. And finally, I think it's important to consider that if there are culturally specific risk factors, these need to be empirically validated as predictive of risk and predictive independently of existing risk factors before they can be incorporated into risk assessment tools. And additionally, it could be the case that these factors are actually better conceived as precursors to risk factors than as independent risk factors themselves. So, for example, exposure to intergenerational trauma, when we talked about that with the Aboriginal participants, they acknowledged that that is often a cause for, say, substance use, for engagement with, antisocial peers. And similarly for the African justice workers, they acknowledged that this phenomenon of kind of confused cultural identity and lack of belonging often causes people to disengage from school, use substances, that kind of stuff, all of which are the established risk factors. So what can we conclude with all that in mind? Essentially, this is an evolving area of research and we do not have all the answers yet. What we do know is that there are differences in the accuracy of risk prediction for people from Black, Indigenous and other non-Western cultures. We know that risk assessment and treatment programs are based on Western norms and therefore may not reflect the norms and experiences of people from non-Western cultures. We need to do a little bit more research to determine if the existing risk frameworks apply cross-culturally and whether there are specific cultural risk factors. In terms of, for now, what can we be doing? I think clinicians need to be really mindful if they're using risk instruments, especially to guide their treatment and management. Their cultural competency is really important. And I think that also goes to organizations, making sure that they provide cultural competency training to their employees for all the cultures that they're working with. And I think we also need to be making an effort to consult with communities to develop culturally sensitive treatment and community support programs to prevent both offending in the first instance and reoffending. So to summarise, we know that there are problems in this space with cross-cultural research. We're unsure why. We probably do need to be changing some things, but we need to do more research to determine exactly what. And that's all I have for now. Thank you so much.